one of the most persistent myths in the Adventist culture is that dinosaurs are the result of amalgamation, and that God wouldn't make such horrible creatures. But if you read the book of Job in chapter 40, he describes something called Behemoth. And the things he says about Behemoth only comport with a dinosaur. Its strength was in its hips. It had a tail like a cedar tree. It ate grass like an ox. It loved the fens and the waters. It had its strength in its hips. That means it walked on two legs. And he says it's the first of the creation of God. So to me, that can only be a dinosaur, and it also can only indicate that these are things that God created. Of course, God made them. The idea is, well, God wouldn't make anything like a T-Rex. Well, would he make something like a lion? And so the questions are similar, and we don't have all the answers. We won't have the answers in this life. But it looks to me like, yes, these are creatures that God made. And as far as amalgamation is concerned, Ellen White says the reason that this class of very large animals, and there is no other class of very large animals from before the flood that we know of, this class of very large animals, God chose not to preserve through the flood because they would be a danger to man, and not because they were the result of amalgamation. So whatever those statements are applied to about amalgamation, I don't think it's dinosaurs. That's my own personal opinion.
Okay, this morning we talked about worldviews, but I didn't explain that. So a worldview, one way to describe a worldview is it's a way of thinking that answers the big questions. Where do we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? It's a way of looking at the world. And a worldview is like that. There's the evolutionist worldview that you use that to explain everything. A Christian worldview, that's the background from which you explain other things. So that's what a worldview is all about.
Yes, there aren't many questions for me, but maybe I'll expand on the worldview just a little bit, just to give some illustrations. There's a pure science. Maybe I'm not using that terminology. A secular scientist will say that there is no activity of God in the world. So if we see activity of God in the world, then we know that's something else. We have to explain that some other way. And they view the world that way. For example, I was watching a television program where they were trying to explain one of these mass shootings at a school. And the commentator asked, is that the result of sin? And the person answering, the psychologist answering, wanted to make sure that everybody knew that was not the result of sin. Now, why was that person denying the possibility that sin was to account for that? Exactly. If you have sin, if there is some standard that we live by, then there has to be somebody that made the standard, and he would have to admit that that was God. So his worldview excluded the possibility of sin. And the worldview excludes the possibility that God came in and did something. For example, sending his son into the world to die. Well, we know that didn't happen because God doesn't act that way. Jesus was just simply a human that unfortunately died on the cross, but he didn't die for our sins. So your worldview determines how you're going to see that kind of thing.
A really interesting question here about birds and dinosaurs. Some tried to say dinosaurs were the first birds. Don't they realize the difference between bird lungs and reptile lungs and so on? Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Birds and mammals and dinosaurs all show up in the fossil record about the same time. And it looks like the dinosaurs that are most bird-like are late. They're upper Cretaceous, whereas the birds are found in Jurassic and lower Cretaceous, and lower down. And so if anything, it would look like the dinosaurs came from the birds, except that they show up about the same time. So, and of course, there are a lot of similarities between birds and dinosaurs. The theropod dinosaurs have hollow bones like birds do. They probably had pneumaticity, which means that their lungs would extend into the bones, and they're very light. Birds are light because they have to fly. I don't know why dinosaurs are light, the theropod dinosaurs. Now, the other dinosaurs, the non-theropod dinosaurs, their bones are not hollow. It's only the theropods. So it's an unanswered question. I wouldn't be too hard on people that want to do that. They want a lot of what dinosaurs are about is about selling books to little kids. And if you could tell little kids that dinosaurs are still around, that's going to be exciting to them. And so there's a lot of politics in dinosaurs.
The question here is asking about these diagrams in evolution books that show how animals evolved. You know, the person I think who asked this question showed me a diagram of the little fossil horse, and then bigger and bigger and bigger ones later in the fossil record. If we do not believe that they evolved, how can we explain the animals' change? Well, I have to get back to worldviews here a little bit. Put it in my words, a worldview constrains you to certain explanations. And a lot of people, they'll ask me questions, and it's clear that they think, okay, the evidence says this, so that must be true. Well, I think maybe the biggest thing that most people don't understand about science, including a lot of scientists, is science is not just built on evidence. You've got two things. You've got evidence and assumptions. Assumptions meaning a certain worldview, the way you decided you understand things. I tell my students sometimes in origins science, studying the past, assumptions rule. Assumptions constrain you to certain explanations. You have to explain it this way because that's what your worldview says. Your worldview says all these different animals resulted from evolution. You have no other choice. You have to, even if, no matter what the evidence says, you have no choice. You have to explain it that way. One of the theories in science is how the first life came about. How did you go from non-life to a bacteria or something? And if you read evolution books or any books that deal with this subject, they will uniformly, confidently explain that life came about by chance reactions of chemicals. Okay, that's a firmly held scientific theory. Well, how much evidence is there for that? Absolutely zero. All the evidence is against it. So why do they believe it? You have to believe it no matter what the evidence says if you don't accept a creator. You have no choice. Okay, and so worldviews, assumptions rule. You got evidence and you got assumptions. The assumptions in so many cases tell you how you have to explain the evidence. Okay, the horses, did they evolve? Well, I don't know if that was changed. All these diagrams that show going from simpler forms of life, and I say simpler, there's no such thing as a simple fossil even, but anyway, simpler forms to complex, that's the way you have to explain it. And so they're not asking, did these things evolve? What they're asking is, okay, we got all these animals, what's the most likely sequence of evolution? That's what they're asking. And so if you ask only that question, you're going to get an answer. You'll easily get an answer. Any of you can take a series of animals from little things to big things. You can arrange them in what seems like the most likely sequence they would have evolved in. I saw a paper a long time ago in a scientific journal about the evolution of the MG automobile. Well, obviously nobody believes they evolved, but you take any series of things and you can arrange them in a logical sequence. Okay, and so is this all goofy? Well, not all. I mean, God did make animals with the ability to change and to adapt. Dogs, all these different kinds of dogs, where did they come from? Well, we know enough about the origin of those different varieties of dogs. We know they did not evolve because most of the several hundred varieties of dogs have been produced by people by selective breeding in the last couple of centuries. The genetic information had to have been there in the original dogs, in the wolves or whatever. And God made them so that we could bring out that variation. It had to be that way. Even from an evolutionist point of view, it had to be that way. There's not time for that to evolve, and those are not generally mutations. That's variation that's in the genetic system already in a wolf, and you can bring it out by selective breeding. Okay, so the horses, at least some of that horse sequence come about by changes after the flood? Well, maybe. It could be. But even if it wasn't, if you believe in evolution, you will come up with a sequence that looks logical. That's just the way what you have to do. Okay, so that's the answer to that one.
Question here, what was the purpose of dinosaurs? Why did God make them? Someday I'll ask him that question. And the other thing is, we shouldn't necessarily assume that God created the dinosaurs that we're digging up now. He didn't create a rattlesnake with venom in it. He didn't create the thistles to begin with. God created a dynamic world with, as Leonard said, already DNA there that could change to new circumstances. And of course we know after sin there was the curse from the sin, which changed some animals as well. So perhaps that could explain why we have dinosaurs the way we do. Also, of course, humankind was better capable of handling something like a dinosaur when we were first created than we are today. So that may not have been quite such an important question to Adam and Eve as it would be to us.
Let me just comment one thing further. Why did God make dogs? Well, I mean, like I say, all these hundreds of varieties of dogs did not evolve. I think God made wolves with dogs in mind. He knew we would need protection and companionship and a lot of other things, the ability to smell out cancer, and so he put that genetic material into the original wolves so that we could produce dogs. There is no other animal that has that kind of genetic flexibility.
Let me just knock out a few here. What is the schedule for 2018? And I can tell you that for any year after that or before that, it's the month of June, plus or minus a day or two. It's the month of June that we're out there. So if you're up wanting to go to the Black Hills or Mount Rushmore or any of that area up there and you're in the area, please come by and see us. Have we found any dinosaur eggs? We haven't found whole eggs, but we have found a few pieces of shell, not very many. It's among the rarest of animals. And here's a really often asked question. With the scattered bones, how are you able to piece together a full creature? How is it not just made up? And again, the answer to that is that if you work with things for a little while, you learn to recognize the bones. So if you hand me any bone out of one of our quarries, I can tell you where it goes on the dinosaur. But that's because I have the experience and have learned how to do that. I couldn't do that when I started. And we know it's not made up because we have whole animals. As I gave you those pictures early on, the whole animal is all there together, and we know that those bones go in that relationship to each other on every other animal, so it's pretty easy.
I'll just ask you one other question. Why did God make cats? Whenever I ask that question, people laugh. I think he made cats to keep us humble, to remind us that we're not in charge. The whale bones, the fossil whales in Peru, what is the elevation level of the site? It's fairly low. It's a coastal plain, goes from sea level to maybe 1,500 feet high. And so that was once under the ocean as a shallow bays, and when the Andes Mountains came up, that was all raised up enough so we could to dig them out.
I don't have any other.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
There are 2 or 3 questions here about fossil people. Okay, anyway, what is the explanation? How do creationists understand fossil men? These fossil cavemen or ape men, there are a variety of fossil that look somewhere between apes and humans. What are they? What's the answer to those? How would you explain them? And they are explained in the evolution books as ancestors to humans, and you can put them in a sequence that looks kind of like that. Now, I have confidence from what Genesis says that those are not ancestors to humans. I don't know what Adam looked like. I don't think he looked like Australopithecus or like an ape. And I would say we don't really know the answer to that. There are some ideas. Maybe, well, okay. There is something that has been determined from evidence. You probably all heard of Neanderthal man, one of these that didn't quite look like us. Well, there's genetic evidence that all of us, most of us here, are 1 to 4% Neanderthal. Asians and Caucasians. That's not true for African blacks, but most of us have some Neanderthal genes. Okay, so somebody was playing around back then. I mean, there was interbreeding between humans and some of these others. I suspect that's the source of some of Ellen White's comments about amalgamation between races after the flood. She wasn't talking about races as we know them, but humans and these Neanderthals and other things. Okay, could this have been true on a larger scale? Well, we can only wildly speculate. I don't know, but perhaps. So there was some of that going on. Some of them perhaps are just varieties of apes. So the shorter answer is we don't really know for sure. That's one of the questions I want to ask when I get to heaven about these guys. And they're related to these same questions asked about very large people reported, like Ellen White talks about large people, and other sources talk about very large human skeletons. There are some pretty tall people today, but not at 9 or 12 feet tall. And were there some skeletons around in the 1800s that we don't have anymore? I don't know. We don't know for sure. That's one of those things. It's interesting to think about, but not terribly important. I guess, let's see, anything else here on that question? No?
I'll just add to what Leonard said. There was a contest on the internet with Photoshop to make giant men fossils, and a lot of Christians and some Adventists got snookered in on that because it was all just fake. But if you see pictures of giant men, especially on the internet, you're probably looking at these Photoshop pictures. All right, here's a question about the ark. Why are there no living dinosaurs if all the creatures went in the ark? I suspect from that statement Ellen White makes that dinosaurs didn't go in the ark, but if they had gone in the ark and they're not alive today, that's not exceptional. There probably were a lot of other animals that died out on this side of the flood. So that's doesn't show anything one way or the other. How far are you from Gillette? And do you have to deal with the coal mines? No. Well, yes. We have to deal with the coal mines. We're about a couple of hours from Gillette. We have to deal with the coal mines because the coal train companies want to send their trains right through our ranch. And so if they did that, it would be a disaster. And so the people have fought it and been able to keep them out so far.
As far as extinction, keep in mind, dinosaurs are famous, but there's a very wide variety of other pre-flood creatures that went extinct in the flood or at the end of the flood. Very great many, not just dinosaurs. There's one question I can't really read. Can you read that, Art?
No.
Okay. Is there a program for figuring out our genealogy called Dateline or something like that? I can't read it. Anyway, I think the question is asking about what is the impact of these methods for figuring out our genealogy. I guess you turn in DNA and you find it out. Well, I guess I think it's just curiosity. I don't know if it has any real significance. That's all I can say about it. A couple questions here about carbon dating. How do we explain it? Is it a relative source of dating materials? Okay, that's a very big question, and I presume really it's asking about radiometric dating in general. Often carbon dating is what we think of because it's more familiar. But that carbon dating is just one method for dating things using radioactive materials. There are elements that are unstable, and through time they change to a different element. Like carbon-14 changes to nitrogen. Yeah, not back to carbon-12, but to nitrogen. Or potassium-40 changes to argon, and so. And this happens at a kind of a measurable rate. And so a rock, when it first forms a layer on the surface of the earth, it has a certain ratio of these two elements, what's called the parent and the daughter. It's never a son element, it's always daughter. I don't know why. But anyway, there's a ratio. And as you go up through the rocks from the older to the younger, these ratios change. And so it's not just nonsense. There is something there. It's a systematic change that means something. And it means at least relative age. Something that has a certain ratio, as you know, is younger than something that has a different ratio. And we can, physicists, I can't, physicists today can measure the rates of decay of those things. And the rates of decay we can measure now, if you apply those, they tell you things are millions or billions of years old. A friend of mine made some interesting comments on this. There is no way you can put a rock into a machine and it'll tell you how old in years it is. There's no machine you could invent that could do that. What do? You put a rock in there and it tells you what is the ratio, how much potassium and how much argon. It measures these ratios. And then you make some assumptions and do a calculation and you figure out an age. So for those who believe in that, I'm sorry, it's not absolute. There are assumptions you have to make and calculations you have to do. But there is something systematic going on there. And if someday we would know enough about these ratios and what affects them, we could know how to explain that. Well, we don't know at this point. We do know of one thing, that there are external factors that can affect that decay rate. And so it's not sort of inherent in the material itself. There are things that can affect it, and we believe that something during the flood has affected these and gives us dates that are not correct. Carbon dating is just one of those methods. Carbon dating can only be done on things that were alive, that have carbon, animals or plants. And so only if you got this geologic column with these, from 540 million years to today, Carbon-14 only works on the very youngest things, not on any. You can't date minerals with it, can't date rocks with it, only things that were alive. Whereas the other methods, you can't date fossils with them, you can only date rocks, generally volcanic rocks. You want to add something?
How can I become part of the research project, or can we visit the site? And I didn't pay them to ask this question. The website's this bottom one down here, dinosaurproject.swau.edu. It's during the month of June. And you can either participate, or if you just want to come by and see it, we welcome you to do that. You have to register at that site before you come. So we welcome anybody who wants to just stop by, and we also welcome you to join us. There are some costs incurred if you join us, but other than that, we'd love to see you. And I'd like to be able to come back here next year and be able to talk to some of those of you who participated.
I can tell you it's quite an experience to go to the site. I took a group of lay people there several years ago, and of course I knew that Art was digging this site for quite a few years, and so when we got onto the campus, I looked at what had been dug up, and I said to myself, and my years might be off, but let's say Art's been here 10 years and this is all he's done. And then I dug for half a day, and when I left, I said, Art's been here for 10 years, and look at how much he's accomplished. So it really is pretty incredible. The other thing that's incredible about this is that, and I don't know, did you tell them about the original scientists? Okay. The farmer had an idea of having the rancher. Thank you. I'm sure that means a lot here in this area. Right. The rancher had an idea of scientists coming in and having a place where these bones could be dug and cataloged and so on and so forth, and it would be a teaching experience for students. But he had one more idea. He wanted to make sure that whoever was doing that also spoke about creationism. Didn't mind if they talked about evolution, but he wanted them to talk about creationism. So he had a scientist from one of the Florida universities come and take a look at the site, and they were putting the agreement together, and then the farmer said, now you must speak about creationism. And at that, the scientist became disgusted. On his way out, he wrote on a barn or something, science will never be done on this ranch again. Well, then the scientist found Art, and Art developed an entirely new way of doing geology. And so amazingly enough, this ranch on which science would never be done had the most up-to-date methods for doing geology, and Art was asked many times in a row to speak to the GSA, the professional society, and tell them, this creationist, tell the evolutionists how to do geology. I thought that was pretty cool.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. This actually concludes our service. So what we're going to do is actually close with a word of prayer, and we hope you have a good rest of the Sabbath. Father in heaven, we thank you because all around us we see evidences of your divine handiwork. Even in our own mirrors as we view ourselves. We ask, Lord, that even though this world is marred by sin, that we can see your love still, and that we can reflect that love to others. Bless us by the knowledge that we have gained this day. Strengthen us in our faith, and help us, Lord, to share our faith with others. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.